Hi, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Education Africa podcast. My name is Annie, and I will be your host for today's discussion. Today's information is going to be very detailed. We are going to be looking into international education or international schooling here in Ghana. And our guest today is Mr. Clemence Tengey, who is a facilitator and a teacher of English theory of knowledge in the international curriculum setting. So we are going to have discussions on what international schooling in Ghana entails, how their system delivery is being rendered, and reasons why it's mostly sought after compared to the other forms of education. Now, before we start this discussion, we will go on a quick commercial break. When we come back, Mr. Clemence and I will have a discussion that is going to be very enlightening and insightful. Welcome, Clemence, and thank you so much for joining our podcast today.
Thank you, Anna, for having me.
All right, it's great to have you today. Before we begin our discussion, can you briefly give us an overview of your thoughts on education? That is teaching professionally, and then maybe a few perceptions of teaching in international school setting in Ghana.
Okay. Speaking about education in general, I think that the world is completely changing. What teachers and students are concerned with today in the classroom or informally, so far as education is concerned, is changing because of the rate of technological acceleration and because the world is becoming a global place. So you have students who keep questioning the value of what they are learning in the classroom and what is going to matter in a couple of years when the world is fast-paced. But I think that modern education has come by far, accommodating technological changes, but also sort of bracing against some of them. That said, it is still relevant because of the circumstances within which we find ourselves. I think that education has that ultimate goal of opening a person's mind to be able to think for themselves. And I don't think that any change in the world, no matter how drastic, is going to make that skill indispensable. So it's changed pretty much from the days of my own schooling to the days of today, where I teach in the classroom. So I think that so far as education in general is concerned, lots of changes, but those changes make education itself more relevant in all aspects.
All right, thank
you. Now,
let
me talk about the general perception of teaching in international schools in Ghana. I think that it is sort of a tough, time-consuming, but rewarding. For most people who are teaching in international curriculums in Ghana, they wouldn't have schooled in the same curriculum. So it means that they're teaching in a curriculum that they're totally new to for the first time. That means a lot of learning on the job, getting to grips with the demands and then the rigors of the curriculum that they're going to teach in. But it's a rewarding experience, and that's why most people from the outside like to think that it's a money-making avenue. So that's that for international education in Ghana.
Okay, thanks so much for your insightful response. So I do agree with you that education becomes a lifelong learning skill for students, and whatever skills that students learn through education will definitely carry them throughout their adulthood. Now, obviously, I really love your perception about education and teaching professionally. So there is something that either pushed you or motivated you into that. So what would you say motivated you to go into the education sector, especially the international school sector, and what has been your most fulfilling moment in this particular area?
Okay. Motivation-wise, I completed the Legon in 2016. I'm very sure you know about that.
Yes.
And the highlight of my stay in Legon academically are punctuated with sessions, group study sessions, where several of my classmates would just say, let's sit down, tell us how to go about this, or what do you know about this, by way of revision for either interim assessment or formal examinations. So at that stage, my perception about the fact that I was very skilled in making people understand things that are complex but also basic was heightened. And when I finished my degree at Legon, I went on to act as a tutorial assistant, and that even further proved the idea that teaching was some sort of a skill that I had or a niche that I have uncovered. And so when I ended my national service assignment, I went straight off to teach in an international school. I wouldn't say that before then I was bent on teaching in an international school. I was just looking forward towards teaching in some manner. It's just that I happened to be there at the right time. And so once I got introduced to that international curriculum, and I realized that even for the high school students, they were dealing with things that were a bit advanced, and then things that push the students to develop very critical skills. I realized that, yeah, if I'm going to sort of teach and then have the impact that I want to have, I'm better suited for this particular domain. So passion-wise or motivation-wise, it's just that ability to explain things to people in a way that makes it understandable. And that's why I'm here as a teacher today.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. I do relate with you, especially with the education that you specify in the international schools, because mostly there's a lot of critical thinking and problem solving skills that are instilled in the student as the curriculum is being delivered. Now, we are mentioning international schools, and I'm sure most of our listeners want to really know in depth about what these international schools in Ghana do. So for those who are unaware, what are the types of curricula that is used in the international schools in Ghana here?
Okay. I think this is an interesting question because unless a lot of those who are not involved in international education directly think only of international schools as schools that exist in one or more countries. So, but that understanding is quite flawed. I think the label international schools, especially within the context of Ghana, has been reserved for those schools that offer a range of programs that are called international. So these are programs that are not locally homegrown, but programs that apply to schools across various countries. So it is in that sense that the school is international because it runs the program that is international, not because of its presence in multiple places. So these programs that we're talking about, obviously, there are a wide range of them. But so far as Ghana is concerned, most international schools coalesce or they sort of surround two major international curricula. You have curriculum from the Cambridge school, so the Cambridge organization, and then you have curriculums from the International Baccalaureate. So if any student is a student of an international school in Ghana, there are high chances that they either fall into a Cambridge school or an IB school. So bottom line is that whatever makes the school international in Ghana is because they run an international curriculum.
To get this clear, you are saying that most or the international schools in Ghana fall between either using a Cambridge curriculum or the IB system. And obviously, it means that these systems are from the international context, and then these students have a broader or international view of education and can also continue their education probably outside the country. All right. So
yes, exactly.
If we should look at how these systems are being run, okay, obviously there might be some challenges. So what are the unique challenges that you think some teachers face when they're teaching this international curriculum here in Ghana?
Okay. I think that I previously mentioned the fact that anybody who's going to sign up to teach in an international school, anybody who's a Ghanaian, will first have to face the difficulty of the fact that they're teaching a curriculum that they haven't not schooled in. You see, so there's a lot of training, professional development that must even take place before the teacher steps into the class for the very first time. And the sense of rigor that is attached to this sort of development and training that makes an individual ready for teaching in the international curriculum setting can be quite challenging, because most schools would likely send you into the classroom and have you continue through training at the same time. Now, it's just already tough to be teaching a class, and combine that with the extra responsibility of learning how to teach what you're already teaching. So that's always going to be a challenge for people teaching in international schools. Granted that only happens in the onset in the onset process, where you're learning or where you're getting on board with the teaching in the first place. But something that you can be sure will run through is that most of these curricula are heavy on documentation and then standards. So you might find yourself doing a lot of necessary paperwork. But the fact that it's necessary doesn't take away from the toll that it can take on the individual teacher. So teachers in international schools in Ghana are expected to keep up their game, to be very sort of organized, and then keep very clean records. That is not easy for the average teacher. So there's constantly that sense of pressure mounted from the outside and within to be abreast with issues. And then maybe largely because of the makeup of these schools, you're dealing with students from a variety of cultural backgrounds. And then sometimes you have to interact with students who have views that are opposite to what you have as a teacher. Students who do not respect your own views or may even question it. So that's also a challenge that we can ascribe to the international schools context in the country.
Okay, so I do agree with your point that because these teachers, they didn't have the background in international schooling, they need to go through vigorous training. Now, regardless of these challenges that the Ghanaian teachers will face in teaching in international schools here in Ghana, do you think that international schools here differ from those in other parts of the world?
Okay. I think that because of the idea of sticking to the standards of whatever program that you're running, we do not see much of a difference in terms of academics and the rigor of it, right? But the specific orientation of schools will make schools in Ghana differ from those in other parts of the world. I think that in some places, there are a wide range of people or students that you can find in the school. Ghana, as it is very sort of welcoming so far as foreigners are concerned. So that means we have a very sort of a healthy influx of people from various cultures and all parts of the world. So that sense of diversity can be at its peak in various places, and that's one thing that makes the international schools in Ghana quite unique, right? In terms of the programs that they run, I think that the idea to maintain the sense of rigor that the traditional Ghanaian curriculum has, even as you pursue the critical thinking and then the sense of progress and new approaches to teaching of the international curriculum, make schools or put schools in some situations that are quite dicey. So sometimes some schools want to obviously place a lot of emphasis on content, even as they are trying to revolutionize the way that they will teach. So what you have then is a mixed match of different curricula. So it's not uncommon to see schools that have maybe, say, Cambridge IGCSE as the first part of their secondary education, and then have the international baccalaureate or diploma as the second part. So that sense of divided goals creates schools that sort of have mixed match curricula. And I think that's one thing that is very common in Ghana.
Okay. So I would also add that, I mean, as an international teacher myself, I do appreciate the fact that the international schools in Ghana do try to include a bit of like the Ghanaian culture in the way that lessons are being delivered and how the Ghanaian culture also being portrayed, which means that there is an importance of cultural sensitivity in the international school here in Ghana. So what is the role of cultural sensitivity in teaching in such educational areas?
Okay. Given that you have students from various walks of life in the classroom that you're going to teach, I think one of the more mundane purposes that being culturally sensitive serves is that it helps you to understand students' behavior, why they act in particular ways, because culture is a very notorious wellspring of what behaviors and attitudes. So the very first and perhaps the best thing that being sensitive to culture is going to give you is that front row seat in understanding why your students act the way they act and how they learn. So that's one of the things to take into consideration. But I think the higher ideal of being culturally sensitive, and this is contained in the document of the curriculum, the curriculum that are international, is that being culturally sensitive allows you to teach in a manner that reflects and preserves what the culture or the traditional orientation of what the students. Because you are supposed to educate, not drastically change or make students question their fundamental beliefs without any good reason. It is important that you educate in a manner that makes students conscious of who they are traditionally or culturally, not entirely sort of change them. And I think the first thing that a teacher needs in order to do that is to understand culture or to be culturally sensitive. Without that, you would take all things for granted. You question your students' cultures. You may even create changes that you do not want. So those are two major reasons why there is a need for cultural sensitivity in teaching in international schools.
Okay. And obviously cultural sensitivity is also important so that there's a lot of inclusion in the teaching and learning process. So since you have experience having multiple culture in a classroom, what strategies have you found to be most important or most effective in teaching these diverse groups of students in your classroom?
Okay. I want to address this from two points of view, right? The strategies that a whole school can sort of like put in place. I taught in one school that draws students from all across Africa and then joins them with students from the host country, which is Ghana, and as well as students from other parts of the world. Now, this is a very culturally diverse school. Now, before students learning can happen, the very first thing to put in place is a safe environment where learners can feel that they have the opportunity to learn. So there is a school ethos in this particular school that makes it clear to every student that regardless of their upbringing, their origins, or their skills, and even the amount of money they have at home, they are all equal in the sense of being students. I think that is very good sense of using school regulations to create a safe space where learners from different cultures can learn in peace in one setting. So there is the idea of using that particular approach in the classroom by creating a space where no student is given priority based on what their culture or where they come from. So that's always an effective way of setting the bar so that you can have a classroom where everybody sort of like learns, right? But I think also that another strategy that is important is a clear consciousness of each student's progress and development. And you have to be very sort of very conscious. It's like a heightened sensitivity about inclusion. So everybody needs to be reined in, and that only happens if you're in tune with what their specific cultural upbringing or the diverse groups that they come from. So I think that always works as a strategy when every student gets to realize that they are understood on what both an individual level and on a common level. And lastly, speaking about commonalities, while students may come from what diverse groups, you can always find what strings that bind them. Perhaps they like a TV show, even though they come from what different countries. Perhaps they like one sort of activity in various what shades. So I think that I also leverage commonalities in order to build some sense of connection between these students who are from diverse groups, and then they understand that while they may be different, they're all trying to achieve the same goal, and that always helps.
Okay, so you did mention earlier that most of these students come from other African countries, or maybe even different countries all over the world that are attending school in this international school here in Ghana. So obviously there's going to be barriers, especially language barrier. So in a school setting like that with language barriers, how do you navigate these barriers in the classroom as a teacher?
Okay, now that's an interesting one. Let me give you a profile of a particular sort of a school, a person. So you see how important navigating language barriers is. Now you have, say, a student from Ethiopia, where Amharic is more or less like the national language, but there is a sense of concern with English, right? Then you have another student from somewhere, Rwanda, where French until recently was a national language, with English was sort of playing a sidekick of a language. Then you have maybe another student from Tanzania, where Swahili is a major language spoken side by side with English. Then you have another student from a totally French-speaking country, right? Now, all of these are in a classroom where you're teaching them language acquisition, English. So you're teaching them English. It means that you need to have a very good idea of where each person's individual strengths and weaknesses start and then end. So one of the ways that I have sort of like navigated those barriers is to decide to like know every student on a personal level, know their sort of trail of education. What have they gone through? What do they already know that you can leverage, and what do they not know? What are their specific problems based on what their country's orientation, so far as the language is concerned, right? So that's one way to navigate the barriers. Know the students very well, so that whatever remedies you're putting in place are very tailored. And so sometimes I've had to work on a one-on-one level, sort of dealing with each student based on the particular the particular difficulty that they have. The other way, obviously, is to sort of leverage other student skills in the classroom. So even though they're all trying to learn, some are clearly maybe doing better than others, and they are the ones who at some point can teach the others better than the teacher can. So identifying those potential strengths and making use of them in regards to the other students is also one key technique to use to navigate language barriers.
Okay, so I would have gone on to inquire about specific instances that you had to adapt teaching approach, but I think you just mentioned that earlier, that having a one-on-one relationship with these students with the language barriers to identify their strengths, weaknesses, and what they already know helps you manage the situation easy and help the education or the learning and teaching process a very smooth one. Now, obviously, international schools are popping all over Africa, and a lot of people or parents are choosing to enroll their students in these schools because of how intense or how, I would say, personal, the learning process is. Would you say that international schools in Africa or in Ghana contribute to development in their local communities? And how do you think they do that?
Okay. I think that, yes, international schools in Ghana contribute to development of education in their local communities. One of the major ways that I think that happens is that if you take the International Baccalaureate, which is one of the two major international curriculums run in the country, um, at both their middle school level programs and then their diploma level programs, there are components that are assessed, right, that require that the students do something for their community. Now, in one of the schools that I've taught in, the students do their project in the community by reaching out to less privileged schools. There was this occasion where they rehabilitated and a library, another case where they set up a computer lab, and another case where they go to the school on a bi-weekly basis to teach the students how to read. So the projects, these sort of like community and personal projects that are the highlights of this international curriculum, in itself make it not just crucial but mandatory for the students to engage in education within the immediate and communities. So that is one way in which international schools in Africa contribute to the development of education in their local communities. I think that's by far the most significant one. There are other ones, but I think this one beats them all.
Yeah, that's very true. And I also do agree because I've also had a first-hand experience seeing how the international schools are involved in, let's say, the local Ghanaian public schools. For example, there's this international school that I'm familiar with that kind of, as you said earlier, renovates and does like community service. They go and see the students, maybe read to them, teach them a few literacy skills here and there, and give them amenities or resources that they think they are lacking that they can actually provide so that they can also get the best education that they could have. Now, I'm glad we're having this discussion because I'm sure most people, in Ghana, are not too sure what is entailed in international schooling and why a lot of people or parents are really inclined to sending their students to such education sectors. Now, I would like to ask you your opinion to just put this discussion into perspective. What makes teaching international school in Ghana or in Africa so rewarding? That is why most teachers, feel it's a bit more satisfying to work in that area as opposed to the other sectors of education.
Okay. I would have started with a different reason, but your questions end. Your question ends with making teachers feel that it's more fulfilling than other sectors of education. I think that makes me want to mention the question of financial remuneration. On the average, I'd like to believe that international schools across the country in other parts of Africa pay a little bit higher than schools that are in more of like the local setting. So that sense of a better pay is one of the reasons why people are not sort of like hesitant to jump onto the international school teaching wagon, even though that would be different, obviously, for different places or different countries and then schools. So that's one of the perks, right, of why teaching this kind of schools in Africa is rewarding. But perhaps a more important one will be the numerous opportunities that are there for professional development. My father taught in the local system, and I think most of the courses that he did, some of them were government sponsored, but much of what you have as a certification along the lines of teaching has to be personally initiated, right? In the international school context, there is always ongoing training because schools understand the need for teachers to be very sort of up to date with current trends in the sort of curricula that they run. So training comes like as a constant. And so there is that opportunity to continue developing in as much as moderations and changes happen to the curriculum that you teach. So that's a second, but perhaps more important reason why teaching in international schools in Africa is rewarding. So those two, a third reason would be maybe being at the vanguard of raising the next generational leaders who know how to address Africa's problems with critical insight and a global understanding, right? I think you agree with me that most of these international schools force or compel students to engage with issues of global interest. And so while they are being taught to think critically, they are also examining these issues that plague the continent and the world at large. And so if you teach in an international school, I think that you have that one-off opportunity to be a defining part, to play a defining role in that, in the lives of those who some years from now are going to be at the helm of affairs. So it's like making your bit towards the country and the continent's progress in the long run.
Oh, thank you.
Those are by far some of the perks. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Clemence. It was quite an exciting and very insightful conversation with her about international schooling in Ghana. So, in summary, simply means that the international schooling uses international curriculum. It's just something that is more intense and very personal when it comes to teaching and learning, and also that the teachers usually go through a lot of training because they need to be updated in the curriculum that they are rendering. It's a very exciting information you've given us, and I'm very excited to have you here and have this discussion. So thank you so much for joining our podcast today, and I'm sure that today our listeners have been able to fully understand what this sector entails and the reason why it's mostly sought after when it comes to the education that is rendered here in Ghana. Thank you so much for joining our podcast and honoring our invitation, Clemence.
Thank you so much, sir. All right. Well, you're welcome.
All right, then.